The wind came down from the mountains the way it always did before a serious storm, not all at once, but in slow, deliberate waves, each one colder and more insistent than the last. It moved across the plains like a living thing, bending the tall grass flat, rattling the dry seed heads of the late-season brush, carrying with it the smell of iron and ice and something else. Something older that every creature on the frontier recognized without being able to name. A warning, a reckoning, the land clearing its throat before it spoke. Caleb Turner rode through it without expression. He was 38 years old, though a stranger meeting him for the first time would have guessed closer to 50. It was not his body that seemed old. His shoulders were still broad, his hand still steady, his eyes still sharp in the particular way of men who have spent years scanning distant ridgelines for movement. It was something else, something behind the eyes, a quality of stillness that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with a man who had stopped expecting the world to surprise him with anything good. He had been a soldier. He had come home from that war with wounds that the body healed and others that it did not. He had built a small farm in the territory with his wife Margaret, a quiet, determined woman who laughed easily and worked without complaint and made even the hardest days feel like something worth having. They had a daughter, 8 months old, round-cheeked and serious-eyed, and just beginning to understand that the world was full of things worth grabbing with both hands. The fever came in January, 3 years ago, moving through their valley like a slow fire. Margaret went first. Then, 4 days later, his daughter. Caleb had buried them both in the frozen ground behind the farmhouse, in graves he dug himself because there was no one else to do it, in a silence so complete that it had never really ended. He had walked away from that farm the following spring and had not looked back once, not because he was strong, because looking back would have finished him. Since then, he had drifted, working here and there when work presented itself, moving on when it did not, speaking when spoken to, sleeping lightly, eating without tasting, living, if you could call it that, in the narrow space between one day and the next, with no particular investment in which direction the road turned. He had been riding for 4 days when the wind picked up and the sky began to bruise at the edges, and he started, without much urgency, to think about shelter. He was scanning the ridgeline to the north when he heard it. A sound, faint, almost nothing, easily mistaken for the wind working its way through a gap in the rocks somewhere nearby. He kept riding. Then it came again. And this time, there was no mistaking it. A human voice, a woman's voice, stripped of everything except pure, desperate pain. Caleb stopped his horse so abruptly the animal shifted beneath him, ears forward, nostrils flared. He sat perfectly still for 3 full seconds, listening with every part of himself. The plains were wide open on all sides. The sky was darkening fast. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees in the last hour. He turned his horse toward the sound and rode hard. The land dropped away suddenly into a shallow creek bed, hidden from the trail by a low ridge and a wall of dead brush. He nearly missed it entirely. His horse picked its way down the short embankment, and then Caleb saw it all at once. The destroyed wagon tilted violently to one side where the wheel had dropped into a hidden gully and snapped the axle like a dry branch. Supplies scattered in every direction, a flour sack split open and slowly bleeding white into the dirt, a tin lantern smashed beyond use, a wool blanket already stiff with cold and damp trampled underfoot. The mule that had been pulling the wagon lay still in the grass a few yards away, its side no longer rising and falling. And against the broken wheel of the wagon, half sitting and half collapsed, her hands gripping the wooden spoke with everything she had left, a young woman. She could not have been more than 22. Her brown hair was loose and wild around her face, pressed flat against her cheeks by sweat, despite the bitter cold. Her dress, once sturdy, once carefully chosen for a long journey, was soaked through in the wrong places, in ways that told Caleb everything he needed to know before she said a single word. Her face was the color of old candle wax. Her eyes, when they found his, were beyond pride and beyond fear and beyond anything except the most naked and fundamental of human communications. "Help me. Please, don't leave." "Please," she said. Her voice came out broken and small. "Please, don't leave me." Caleb was off his horse before the words finished leaving her mouth. Later, if anyone had asked him what he felt in that moment, he would not have been able to answer easily. He did not feel brave, he did not feel called or chosen or any of the things that stories like to attach to moments like this one. What he felt was the absolute physical impossibility of riding away, as if his body had made the decision before his mind had the chance to complicate it. He knelt beside her, took her wrist in 2 fingers. Her pulse was there, fast and thin, but there. "How long?" he asked. "Since..." She stopped, gripped by a contraction that arched her back and stole her breath entirely. He held her arm steady and waited, watching her face, counting silently. When it passed, she fell back against the wheel, gasping. "Since yesterday afternoon." Caleb did not allow his expression to change. He stood up and moved with a calm and deliberate efficiency that had nothing to do with feeling calm. It was the discipline of a man who had learned in the worst possible classroom that panic was a luxury that cost lives. He built a fire, not a small, cautious one, but a real one, stacking the broken wagon boards and the dry brush and feeding it until it pushed back the dark and the cold in a meaningful radius. He strung the canvas tarp from the side of the wagon to 2 stakes he drove into the creek bank, creating an angled shelter that would deflect the wind. He found 2 blankets, one soaked through, useless, the other buried under a crate and still mostly dry. He heated water in a bent tin cup balanced over the flame. Through all of it, Emily watched him. He could feel her eyes following his movements the way a drowning person watches the rope being thrown, not yet daring to believe it will reach. "What's your name?" he asked, settling beside her again. "Emily Carter." Another wave of pain moved through her, and she rode it with her teeth clenched and her eyes shut, making a sound low in her throat that was somehow more heartbreaking than screaming would have been. When it passed, "My husband went ahead to find land. He doesn't know where I am. We'll find him after," she repeated, as if the word were a country she wasn't sure she'd live to see. He took her hand, not gently, firmly, the way you hold a person who needs to feel that at least one thing in the world is not moving. "Listen to me, Emily Carter. When the pain comes, you breathe first, long and slow through your nose, out through your mouth. Then when your body tells you to push, you push with everything. Don't fight it, work with it." He looked directly into her eyes. "I am not going anywhere. Do you understand me?" She looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression, not relief exactly, but the decision to trust. The decision to stop fighting alone. She nodded, and the night began in earnest. What followed was the longest and most demanding hours of Caleb Turner's life, and he had lived through a war. There was nothing heroic about it in the way that stories like to describe heroism. It was simply hard. It was Emily's body doing the ancient, brutal, magnificent work it was built to do, and it was Caleb staying exactly where he was through all of it, talking her through the contractions, keeping the fire from dying, monitoring her pulse, watching her face with the careful attention of a man who has learned to read the precise difference between a person who is suffering and a person who is letting go. There were moments when he was not sure which one he was watching.
There was a moment somewhere in the middle of that night when Emily went quiet between contractions in a way that frightened him more than her screaming had. Her head fell back. Her eyes went distant. He called her name sharply, once, twice, and put his hand against her face. "Emily, right here, stay with me." Her eyes found his slowly, like a lamp being turned up from a very low flame. "I'm here," she whispered. "Yes, you are, and you're staying." He did not know in that moment whether he was talking to her or to something older, some force in himself that had been trying to leave for 3 years and had just, without ceremony or announcement, decided to stay. The fire burned low, and he fed it. The wind picked up, and he repositioned the canvas.
The baby's position shifted, and he talked Emily through it, his voice steady and sure in a way that he manufactured entirely from will, and she trusted that voice the way a person lost in the dark trusts the sound of another person calling their name. Then, in the hour before dawn, in that strange, suspended moment when the night is over but the day is not yet committed to arriving, "I can see him," Caleb said quietly. Emily made a sound that had no language in it. "This is it," he told her. "Everything you have left, all of it, right now." She gave it. Every last piece of it, every ounce of strength left in a body that had been fighting for 18 hours, every stubborn refusal to surrender, every desperate love for the child she had not yet held. She gathered it all up and she gave it. And a boy was born. Into the firelight and the cold and the vast, indifferent silence of the frontier, a child arrived and announced himself with a cry so clear and so furious and so completely, defiantly alive that Caleb Turner felt something happen in his chest that he had no name for. Something cracked open. Something that had been sealed shut for 3 years shifted on its hinges, and through the gap came something raw and warm and overwhelming that he had to turn his face away for a moment before he could trust himself to speak. He wrapped the boy in the dry blanket with hands that were not entirely steady. He placed him against Emily's chest. She looked down at her son, and the expression on her face, that expression, was something Caleb had only seen twice in his life. Once when Margaret had first held their daughter, and now here in a ruined creek bed in the middle of a storm, on the face of a young woman who had come closer to death than she knew to welcome the life she had fought so hard to keep. He watched her for one long moment. Then he saw the blood. He moved immediately, and he moved fast, pressing cloth against her, applying pressure, working with the focused desperation of a man who has just watched something extraordinary happen and refuses to let it be taken back. His jaw was tight, his hands were sure, his mind was doing something it had not done in 3 years, bargaining, pleading, demanding in the silence of his own skull that this woman be allowed to stay. Emily sensed the change in him. She looked at him with eyes that had gone soft at the edges. "Am I dying?" she asked, very quietly, without drama. "No," he said. The word came out harder than he intended. "You're scared," she said. "I'm working," he said. "There's a difference." A faint smile crossed her face, exhausted, real. The baby made a sound. She looked down at him, then back at Caleb. "Tell me something," she said softly. "Tell me something about yourself, so I have something to listen to." A long pause. The fire popped. The wind pressed against the canvas overhead. "I had a wife," he said finally. His voice was different now, quieter, rougher at the edges. "Margaret. She was a good woman. Better than I deserved, probably." He paused. "We had a daughter, 8 months old. The fever came through 3 winters ago and took them both in the same week." Emily was quiet for a moment. "What was your daughter's name?" she asked. He had not said her name out loud since the funeral, had not let himself. The word lived in him like something too fragile to expose to air. "Clara," he said. Emily reached out and touched his arm, just briefly, just with her fingertips. "Clara was lucky," she said, "to have a father who would have stayed." Something moved through Caleb Turner in that moment that he could not have described and did not try to. He simply pressed his lips together and nodded once and kept working. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the bleeding came under control. Emily's color, which had been the color of old ash, began to inch back towards something more human. Her pulse, which had been thin and frightened, steadied itself. The baby slept against her chest with the absolute confidence of the newly born, knowing nothing about how close the margin had been. Toward dawn, Emily's eyes found his again. "If something happens," she began. "It won't." "Caleb," her voice was quiet but firm. "If something happens, take him to his father, Thomas Carter. He's heading for the Valley settlements west of the river." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "I promise," he said. She closed her eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for not riding past." He said nothing. He sat with his back against the broken wagon wheel and the fire burning between them, and the baby sleeping, and the sky beginning, at last, to lighten at its eastern edge, pale gold threading through the iron gray of the coming storm. He thought about the last 3 years, about all the mornings he had woken up and spent the first few seconds of consciousness deciding whether the day was worth beginning, about the particular emptiness of riding without direction, without anyone waiting, without anything ahead that mattered. He looked at the sleeping child. He thought, Clara would have been 3 years old now. And then, for the first time since he had dug those 2 graves in the frozen ground, for the first time in 1,000 days of determined, deliberate numbness, Caleb Turner let himself feel it. All of it. The grief and the love and the loss and the terrible, beautiful unfairness of it. He sat with it in the early morning cold, with someone else's child breathing quietly nearby. And he let it move through him like the storm that was building on the horizon. When it passed, he felt hollowed out, and lighter, and something else. Something cautious, and fragile, and new. Almost human again. The storm arrived by mid-morning, savage, howling, driving snow sideways across the open plains. Caleb got Emily and the baby onto his horse and they moved, slowly and carefully, through a world that had turned white and merciless. Every step the horse took was deliberate. Every gust of wind was a negotiation. The 3 riders appeared through the snow like shapes that the storm had invented. They said what men like that always said, reasonable words in unreasonable voices, offers of help that were not offers of help. Caleb answered them the way he answered everything now, directly, without wasted words, with his right hand exactly where it needed to be. The riders moved aside. Caleb rode past. He found the abandoned shack, got the fire going, got Emily settled, sat by the door with his pistol and listened to the storm. When the pounding came, he was ready. The fight was short and brutal and cost him a burn across his left arm that bled freely for an hour before he got it browned. When it was over, he sat back against the wall and listened to the silence and the storm and the baby making small sounds in Emily's arms. "Is it done?" she asked. "It's done," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, at his arm, at his face. "You're going to need someone to look after that," she said. He almost smiled. "You're offering?" "I'm saying," she said quietly, "that you shouldn't have to do everything alone." The storm spent itself by morning. The world outside the shack was white and still, and in its own severe way, beautiful. They found Thomas Carter 2 days later at a trading post near the river settlements, a tall, lean man who had been asking everyone he met if they had seen a wagon, a woman, a mule. When he came through the door and saw Emily and his son, he made a sound that Caleb had heard before, the sound a person makes when something they had already started grieving turns out to still be alive. Thomas Carter gripped Caleb's hand for a long time without speaking. When he finally found words, he said, "How do I repay something like that?" Caleb shook his head. You don't. He stayed for one meal. He held the baby one last time, this small, loud, furious proof that life does not ask permission before arriving. He looked at the baby's face for a long moment, then handed him back to his mother, shook Thomas Carter's hand, and walked out into the cold morning. He stood beside his horse for a moment before mounting. The road west stretched out ahead of him, white and clean under the new snow. The sky was pale blue and enormous, and completely clear, washed out by the storm into something that looked, for the first time in days, like a beginning rather than an ending. He thought of Margaret. He thought of Clara. He thought of them the way he had not let himself think of them in 3 years. Not with the sealed, careful grief of a man trying not to break, but openly, fully, with love that did not try to protect itself. He let himself miss them. And then he let himself ride. Not away from anything, not toward nothing, simply forward. Into a morning that felt, against all reasonable expectation, like it might be worth seeing all the way through. Some storms take everything. They come without warning, and they take the crops and the years and the people you built your whole life around, and they leave behind a silence so complete that it stops feeling like an absence and starts feeling like the natural state of things. But if you stay in the saddle long enough, if you ride toward the sound instead of away from it, if you let yourself be asked for everything on a cold night in a ruined creek bed with no one watching and nothing to gain, the storm will leave something behind. Not what it took, never that. What is gone stays gone, and the sooner a person understands that truth, the sooner they can begin to live honestly inside it. But something else. A name spoken out loud for the first time in 1,000 days. A child placed in your arms who does not know your sorrow and does not care, and breathes against your chest with perfect, devastating trust. A woman's hand on your arm saying, you would have stayed. A road that means something again. Caleb Turner rode west. And for the first time in 3 years, for the first time since the frozen ground and the silence and the long gray business of surviving without living, he was not alone inside himself. And that, on the frontier, on a clear morning after a hard storm, with the whole wide world laid out ahead and nothing decided yet, that was enough. That was everything. If this story reached something inside you, if Caleb's ride reminded you that grief does not have to be the last word, that broken people can still show up when it matters most, then you are exactly who Desert Heart is made for. Subscribe to Desert Heart today. Every week a new story. Stories of quiet courage and loyal hearts and ordinary people who find in the hardest moments that they are more than they thought they were. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us what moment stayed with you longest. And come back next time, because the next story is already waiting. This is Desert Heart, where every soul deserves to be heard. This story carries meaning on several levels that extend beyond entertainment. It portrays veteran grief, the specific, isolating grief of a man who survived war only to lose everything quietly afterward. Honesty and dignity, offering older viewers a mirror for experiences they may recognize in themselves or in people they love. It honors the historical reality of frontier childbirth, when women regularly faced the most dangerous moments of their lives without medical help, alone or dependent on the courage of strangers. It models what genuine courage actually looks like, not fearlessness, but action taken in spite of fear, in service of someone else, with nothing to gain. Most profoundly, it carries the message that grief, when finally allowed to be felt rather than sealed away, becomes the very thing that reconnects a person to life. For older American viewers who have carried their own losses for years, that is not simply a story. That is permission.